In the last video, I talked about how you might see development around a ring road because there's so much more traffic going by. And in essence, what's happening here is that that ring road has become a fairly accessible place. And that makes the land around it a more valuable commodity. So in this last video in the module, we're going to talk about something called land rent theory. This is sometimes called bid rent theory. And this is a fancy way of describing how the demand for land, which is then reflected by the price for land or the rent of that land, is proportional to its accessibility. This helps explain why we see a gradient of density and accordingly a gradient in price of land across an urban landscape, and how there might actually be fluctuations so that it's not a constant gradient going out from a central place, but you might actually see, localized spikes in the density and the price of land in central places where you see, for example, a confluence of transportation infrastructure. So the basic premise behind land rent theory is that it's valuable to be close to a center. Now, this also means that it's valuable to be close to a transportation network that essentially warps the mobility in that area, that allows for really high speed or low price access to a center. So we can imagine how it might be fairly costly to live right close to this point A. And so, we're going to see a lot of demand for living, close to the center, close to the central business district, perhaps. And then we'll see a drop off in demand for living close to that place, and accordingly a drop off in price as we get farther away from that central place. But we see really similar patterns along transportation corridors. So imagine that B is a freeway that is, going from a point on the outskirts of the city into the center. We're actually going to see fairly high demand for living close to that freeway corridor, perhaps to be more specific, close to exits. So we this diagram might be a little oversimplistic because it's not showing places you could actually get onto the freeway, or if this was a rail line, the stops along a rail line, you might see centers that are a little bit more like this, where the price of living right around a rail stop or a freeway exit actually goes up relative to a place that's slightly closer to the center but doesn't have that same access. And then you see a gradient drop off in price and density away from those transportation infrastructures. So that's what essentially causes this star-like pattern that we saw previously, where there are these gaps in development between these axes of high mobility that give access to the central place. So land rent theory and the relationship between demand for land and its rent being proportional to its accessibility really fundamentally underlies all of the development patterns that we see in an urban place. It's usually not quite as simple as this. There's usually a lot more sort of intricate structure of transportation networks and how different aspects of geography might distort accessibility. So we don't end up with a pattern that's quite so perfectly shaped as we see in this example. But nonetheless, we can essentially use this theory to help explain the extents of development and the places that we see concentrations and where we see development tapering off toward outlying areas.